They said I was too old to drive. My own grandson said it. Standing in my kitchen, in the house I bought, when gas was 23 cents a gallon, holding my car keys like he'd just rescued the neighborhood from a menace. I remember the sound more than the words. The light, metallic jingle as he turned the keys in his palm. The faint, nervous smile. The one people wear when they're about to do something cruel but call it kindness. "You're 78, Grandma," he said. "We're just worried." Worried. That word. How easily it disguises control. How softly it cuts. I was still in my robe, morning coffee half drunk, the cat winding between my legs. He'd come by just to check on me, or so he'd said on the phone. I should have known better. No one comes to check on you at 9 a.m. on a Saturday without a reason. He looked so sure of himself, tall and careful, the face of someone raised to believe he knows better. "You could get hurt," he went on, and then Mom would never forgive herself. His mother, my daughter, was standing behind him with that pinched look she gets when she wants to seem firm but not cruel. "It's just a precaution," she said. "You've had a few close calls." Close calls. I hit the curb once backing out of the driveway last winter because the trash cans were still out. It wasn't a catastrophe. It was life. But I could feel it. The quiet trial I hadn't agreed to, the verdict already decided before I spoke. I looked at Evan, my grandson, and saw not malice but conviction. That dangerous blend of righteousness and ignorance that only the young possess. I wanted to tell him I'd been driving longer than he'd been alive, that I'd once changed a tire in the middle of a snowstorm while his grandfather stood helpless in a pair of wet shoes. But the words caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. He reached past me and took the keys from the counter. Just like that. No argument, no request, just took them, as if my consent were optional. "You'll thank me later," he said. That sentence, the arrogance of it, made my stomach twist. I watched him pocket the keys, and I felt something inside me, something that had survived widowhood, arthritis, cataract surgery, and 30 years of paying bills on time, begin to crack. "You have no right," I managed. My voice came out steady, which surprised even me. He smiled, the way people smile when they think they're being patient with a child. "We're just trying to keep you safe." Safe. As if safety were worth this humiliation. As if I hadn't spent decades keeping other people safe. Evan, his mother, his father before the divorce. All of them held together by the invisible labor they never saw. After they left, the kitchen felt unfamiliar, like a stage set after the actors have gone home. The coffee had gone cold. The cat sat on the windowsill watching me, its tail flicking like a metronome for my thoughts. I stared at the empty spot on the counter where my keys had been. It's strange how such a small absence can feel like an amputation. The sun was coming in through the blinds, dust dancing in the air, and for the first time in years, the light felt intrusive. I thought about calling Evan, demanding them back, but I didn't. Because what would that sound like? A frail old woman begging permission to move about the world? I wasn't ready to hear my own voice in that role. I walked to the living room, sat in my late husband's chair, and tried to imagine what he would have said. Derek had always believed in restraint. "Pick your battles, Marjorie," he used to tell me. "Some fights aren't worth the energy." But this one, it didn't feel like a fight. It felt like erasure. I looked around the room at the photographs on the mantel. Our wedding day, my daughter as a child, Evan as a newborn in my arms. All those moments frozen in time, all of them proof that I had once been central to something. Now I was just a liability. The phone rang twice that morning. First my daughter, then my neighbor Dottie. Both conversations had the same undertone, that syrupy concern. "You know, honey, maybe it's for the best," Dottie said. "At our age, the roads aren't made for us anymore." As if asphalt had developed a prejudice. I thanked her politely, hung up, and stood by the window watching the street. A young man jogged past with earbuds in, oblivious. The mail truck rumbled by. Life continued in its indifferent rhythm. But inside, I felt the slow press of something unbearable. The realization that they didn't see me anymore, not as capable, not as someone who could choose. They saw a collection of risks. Brittle bones, dim eyes, slower reaction times. They'd turned my existence into a checklist of potential accidents. I walked to the garage, opened the door, and looked at the empty space where my Toyota usually sat. The oil stain on the floor seemed like a memory of motion. I ran my fingers along the workbench, the cool dust of it sticking to my skin. I had always loved that car, not because it was special, but because it represented continuity. I'd driven it to funerals and baby showers, to the grocery store and to the coast to watch the tide roll in. Every dent had a story. The small one near the fender from the time Evan, at 10, swung his bike too wide and scraped it. The faint scuff on the bumper from parallel parking in the rain. I remembered laughing about it back then, telling him not to worry. Now, the same boy had declared me unfit to hold a steering wheel. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a pad of paper, thinking I might write him a letter. But what was there to say that wouldn't sound like pleading? "Please let me have my life back." I tore the paper in half and threw it away. I wasn't crying. The tears that come from that kind of betrayal don't fall. They calcify. They turn into silence, into the stillness between breaths. I thought of all the women I'd known who'd been politely stripped of their independence, neighbors who'd been moved into assisted living because their families thought they'd be happier among strangers, widows whose children sold their homes under the guise of simplifying. It always started small, a taken key, a canceled credit card, a quiet suggestion to let us handle it. I had nodded along to their stories with sympathy before. Now I understood the terror underneath. When I went to bed, the house creaked in that familiar way old houses do, wood shifting against time. I lay awake listening, not to the sounds, but to the absence of my own engine outside. For 40 years, that soft metallic click of the cooling hood had been part of my nights, proof that I could go anywhere if I wanted to. Now it was gone. I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. They felt useless, like asking for forgiveness from someone who didn't think you'd sinned. I closed my eyes and saw the flash of the keys in Evan's hand, the smug certainty of youth. By morning, the anger had settled into something colder, quieter. I made breakfast the way I always did, oatmeal, black coffee, the radio low. But the routine felt like mimicry. When my daughter called to check in, I let it go to voicemail. She left a message full of warmth and subtext. "Hope you're taking it easy, Mom. Maybe this is a good time to rest." Rest. That word again. They all wanted me to rest, to retreat, to fold neatly into the soft corners of their conscience. But rest is for those who feel safe, not for those who've been quietly stolen from. I went to the window again. The day was bright, almost offensively so. A delivery truck pulled up across the street, and for a moment I saw my reflection in the glass, hair a little thinner, eyes still sharp. I didn't look like someone who needed rescuing. I looked like someone who'd been underestimated one too many times. The cat brushed against my leg and meowed, impatient for food, and I laughed. A dry, surprising sound. It reminded me that I was still here, still capable of laughter, of decision. Evan thought he'd done something noble. He thought he'd taken away a danger. He didn't understand that he'd awakened one instead. That afternoon, I opened the drawer where I keep old papers, insurance forms, receipts, expired warranties, and there it was. A small metal glint tucked behind a folder. The spare key. I hadn't seen it in years. I held it in my palm, feeling its weight, feeling my pulse steady. The key was cool and familiar, a promise and a memory at once. I didn't move yet. I just stood there, the afternoon sun sliding across the floor, the air humming with the quiet defiance of an old woman, remembering she's still the owner of her own life. The next morning began like any other, except that the silence in the kitchen had a new texture to it, something brittle and watchful, as if the walls themselves were waiting for my reaction. I moved through my routine with mechanical precision. Coffee, toast, vitamins lined up in their weekly case, though the taste of everything felt altered, dulled by the aftertaste of humiliation. I kept seeing Evan's hand closing around the keys, that easy assumption of authority, that small, smug victory of the young over the old. The morning sun hit the counter where the keys had been, and I realized that even light could mock you if you gave it time. I poured the coffee into my travel mug, an old blue one with faded lettering from a road trip Derek and I had taken to the Grand Canyon. And for a brief second, I allowed myself to imagine that I could simply walk out, climb into my car, and drive wherever I pleased. But imagination wasn't motion. The car was gone, and with it, the illusion of choice. By noon, I decided to walk to the pharmacy, a half-mile stretch of cracked sidewalks and uneven curbs that I had driven 1,000 times. It wasn't far, but without the car it felt like a test of endurance, like the world had suddenly expanded just to remind me how small I'd become. I wore my sun hat and sturdy shoes, and every step carried the dull echo of resistance. At the pharmacy, the clerk, a girl barely older than Evan, smiled too brightly. "Oh, Mrs. Clark, we heard you're not driving anymore. That's so good." "Safety first, right?" she said, scanning my prescriptions. I didn't answer, just watched her youthful hands move quickly across the counter, capable, unthinking, untouched by time. The humiliation wasn't in what she said, but in what she didn't need to say. Word travels fast when someone old is deemed incapable. I walked home slowly, feeling my independence like a phantom limb. Still there in memory, gone in function. When I reached my porch, I saw my daughter's car parked in the driveway. I knew immediately it wasn't a social visit. Her silhouette was visible through the living room window, pacing, gesturing. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of her perfume, that sharp floral scent that always made me think of closed rooms and rehearsed conversations. "Mom, we just need to talk," she said as I walked in. I could tell she'd been waiting for this, her speech already formed, her tone balanced between concern and command. "Evan told me you were upset yesterday. He didn't mean to upset you. He was just trying to protect you." Protect me. From what? From the ability to make my own mistakes? From the possibility of being human? I sat down in my chair, folded my hands, and looked at her the way a teacher might look at a student who has memorized the wrong lesson. "You could have called first," I said. "I thought we didn't need appointments," she replied, with that careful half-smile that never quite reached her eyes. "We're family." She walked to the counter, picked up my empty mug, and rinsed it like she owned the kitchen. "You've always been so independent, Mom, but maybe it's time to let people help you. You don't have to prove anything." Her voice softened on the last sentence, as if pity were a balm. I wanted to laugh. "Let people help," she said, as though help were ever freely given. "Help always has terms. Help always has a cost." I told her I was fine, that I didn't need anyone to drive me, that I had managed my whole life without supervision. She looked at me like I'd said something inappropriate. "Mom, don't make this hard. We've already talked to Dr. Singh, and he agrees it might be time to consider limiting your driving. Reaction time's slow, vision changes. It's normal." I stared at her. "You spoke to my doctor?" She nodded, not ashamed. "We're just worried." That word again, worried, like a knife disguised as a lullaby. I felt something inside me tighten. Not anger exactly, but the cold awareness of betrayal that comes when people you love start making decisions in rooms you're not invited to enter. My daughter leaned against the counter, crossing her arms like a lawyer waiting for a confession. "It's not forever," she said. "Maybe later we can revisit it." I wanted to ask her what later meant. What age was acceptable for autonomy to end? 80, 90, or whenever it became convenient for her schedule. Instead, I just said, "You're treating me like a problem you're trying to manage." She sighed. "Mom, please don't be dramatic. You know how Evan feels. He's terrified something might happen to you." "He's terrified of guilt, not loss," I said. "That's not the same thing." She flinched, then straightened her shoulders. "We're trying to help you transition gracefully." That word, transition, made me laugh out loud. A short, dry sound that startled even her. "What am I transitioning to?" I asked. "A decorative state of being?" She left soon after, angry in that contained, righteous way adult children get when they think they've done the responsible thing and their parent refuses gratitude. I watched her car reverse out of the driveway and drive off, the sound of the engine fading into the distance like an insult that refuses to echo. The house was silent again, but the silence felt different now. Not hollow, but waiting. I walked to the cabinet where I kept my paperwork, deeds, insurance, Derek's old pension forms, and opened the folder labeled Vehicle. My name, printed clearly in black ink, next to the make and model of my car. Mine. Legally, financially, unequivocally mine. I traced my finger along the edge of the paper, the faint grit of the copy toner against my skin, and felt a small surge of clarity. The theft wasn't just emotional, it was factual. They'd taken what wasn't theirs under the banner of affection. That night, I received a call from Evan. His voice was hesitant, rehearsed. "Hey, Grandma, just checking in. How are you feeling?" I could hear the rustle of his mother in the background, whispering, coaching him. I said I was fine. "You're not mad, right? I didn't mean to upset you. I saw something online about elderly drivers and accident rates. It's scary, you know?" I closed my eyes, listening to him justify his violation with statistics. "Evan," I said quietly, "did you know when your grandfather taught me to drive, he said the hardest part was convincing people to trust themselves behind the wheel? Not the car, not the road, yourself." There was a pause. "I just don't want anything bad to happen to you," he said. "Something already did," I replied, and hung up. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The house was too still, too conscious of my restlessness. I got up around midnight and walked to the garage again. The air smelled of oil and concrete and the faint metallic ghost of motion. I imagined the car parked there, imagined my hands on the wheel, the hum of the engine, the steady pulse of autonomy. I remembered every trip I'd made to the hospital when Derek was sick, every late-night drive home after his treatments, the quiet roads that had carried my grief without judgment. The car had been my companion through all of it, my last piece of partnership. Losing it felt like losing him all over again. In the morning, I made a list. Not out of impulse, but precision. The license renewal date, the insurance policy number, the spare key location. Facts, not emotions. Facts are the armor of the disbelieved. I tucked the list into my purse and decided I would go to the DMV that week just to confirm everything was still valid. I didn't trust that my daughter wouldn't have accidentally reported something. The air outside was bright and sharp, the kind of day that makes the world look honest, even when it isn't. As I stood on the porch, I saw Dottie again, watering her azaleas. "Need a ride, honey?" she called. "No, thank you," I answered, maybe a little too sharply. "Just walking." She smiled the way people smile at toddlers, insisting on tying their own shoes. Halfway down the street, I realized that I was no longer sad. The sadness had been replaced by a slow, deliberate resolve. This wasn't about a car anymore. It was about being edited out of my own life. They thought I would let it happen quietly, that I would sit by the window and knit away my defiance. They didn't understand that age doesn't erase instinct. It sharpens it. It teaches you when silence is the most strategic weapon. When I reached the corner, I looked both ways, not for traffic, but for witnesses, and whispered to myself, "They've mistaken obedience for fragility." The wind carried the words away, but they were mine. Later that evening, I called the mechanic who'd serviced my car for years, an old friend named Raoul. "Just checking if everything's up to date," I said casually. "Everything's perfect," he replied. "She's in great shape for her age." "So am I," I said before hanging up. And for the first time since Evan's visit, I felt something like peace. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the steady rhythm of purpose returning, one quiet beat at a time. For 3 days, I tried to behave as if nothing had changed, to pretend that the silence around the missing car was just another passing discomfort, something that would settle itself once the family's nerves calmed. I walked to the grocery store with a wheeled basket that clicked and rattled over the sidewalk cracks, pretending it was exercise rather than necessity. I smiled at neighbors, listened to the local news, cooked the same dinners I had always cooked, but everything tasted faintly metallic, like I'd been chewing on shame. What unnerved me most was how quickly people adjusted to the new version of me. The cashier at the market offered to carry my bags, even though I had done it alone for years. Dottie called to say she was driving to the library and could pick up my holds for me. "Save you the trip." The mailman lingered one afternoon, asked if I was managing okay. It was as if the news had spread that I'd crossed an invisible border, that I was no longer to be trusted with something as simple as distance. I tried to laugh it off, to remind myself that kindness isn't always condescension, but every offer carried a faint echo of that Saturday morning. I'd see Evan's face every time someone said, "Be careful." I knew my daughter had been talking, warning the neighbors under the guise of community concern. "Mom's decided to stop driving," she'd probably said. using that polite euphemism that implies choice where there was none. People love stories that make them feel generous. I'd given them one. The hardest part wasn't the walking, it was the waiting. Every errand required permission from the weather, from bus schedules, from the availability of others. I, who had once driven across 3 states to surprise Derek on his business trip, now planned my days around the favor of others. I hated how quickly dependence crept in, like ivy along a wall, pretty at first, then suffocating. I told myself I still had control over small things: what to cook, what to read, when to open the windows. But at night I could feel that control thinning, becoming transparent. There were moments when I would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, half convinced that I heard the engine of my car pulling into the driveway, the familiar growl of homecoming. I'd sit up, heart pounding, only to realize it was the neighbor's son coming back from his shift. The disappointment would hit like a second heartbeat. On the 4th day, my daughter dropped by unannounced again, this time with groceries and that rehearsed cheerfulness that always preceded something unpleasant. "I picked up a few things," she said, unloading the bags before I could refuse. "Frozen dinners, some soup, easy stuff. No need for you to cook so much." I watched her stack the packages in my freezer and thought of how foreign my own kitchen had begun to feel. "I like cooking," I said. "It's not about need." She didn't answer, just smoothed the front of her blouse and said, "You should rest more, Mom. I saw a flyer at the community center. They're offering free transportation for seniors now. Maybe you could sign up." I laughed softly. "You mean the van that picks people up like laundry?" She frowned. "Don't be ungrateful. It's convenient." Convenient. The word people use when they want to make control sound like efficiency. I nodded just to end the conversation. That evening, I found myself standing at the window, watching the sun go down behind the neighbor's maple tree. The sky was that pale violet that only appears for a few minutes before darkness, and I suddenly remembered the feel of that light through my windshield. How it had always marked the end of errands, the quiet drive home with the radio low, and Derek humming tunelessly beside me. The memory was so sharp it made me dizzy. I gripped the curtain edge and whispered to the empty room, "I'm not done yet." The next morning, I went through every drawer in the house until I found the spare key I'd glimpsed days earlier. It was tucked inside an old sewing box, wrapped in tissue, as if even the metal had been waiting for permission. I held it in my hand for a long time, tracing the ridges with my thumb, feeling the weight of it like an artifact of freedom. I didn't plan anything elaborate. I just wanted to drive, to feel the world slide past the windows again, to remember who I was before being managed. I called a taxi to take me to the storage lot, where I knew Evan had parked the car. He'd been clever enough not to leave it in my garage, but not clever enough to imagine I'd find it. He'd mentioned the name of the lot once when bragging about helping get Grandma's car somewhere safe. The clerk didn't even question me. The registration was in my name. "You're all set, ma'am," he said, handing me the keys. "She's right out back." The moment I slid into the driver's seat, a wave of something close to grief washed over me. The smell of old upholstery, the little crack on the steering wheel, the way the seatbelt caught for half a second before releasing, all of it was memory made tangible. I started the engine, and the sound was so familiar it felt like a pulse returning to my veins. I didn't think about where to go. My hands knew before my mind did. I drove through town, past the pharmacy, past the school where I used to drop off my daughter, past the church that now sent postcards inviting me to senior luncheons. I kept going until the streets thinned out, and the houses gave way to the open road leading toward the lake. The sky was clear, the air cool. For a moment, it felt as if time had folded, as if I were 30 again, just learning to drive with Derek in the passenger seat, telling me to ease into the curve, not fight it. The road curved, and I eased. I turned on the radio, static first, then a song from decades ago, one of those melodies that survive every generation. I drove until the sun tilted low, until I could feel the day exhaling. I parked by the lake and sat there with the windows down, the smell of water and pine drifting in. The waves moved softly against the shore, whispering the kind of peace that doesn't need witnesses. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed, and it felt like the first honest breath in weeks. On the drive back, I stopped at the gas station on the edge of town. The attendant, a boy with a pierced ear, grinned and said, "Haven't seen you in a while, Mrs. Clark." I smiled back, calm and deliberate. "I've been busy," I said. I paid in cash the way I always did and watched the numbers spin on the pump. Gas had gone up again. Everything does eventually. When I returned home, the house looked different. Not physically, but in the way a stage looks once the actors have been unmasked. The stillness no longer frightened me. It felt like ownership. I parked the car in the garage, turned off the engine, and sat there for a while listening to the tick of the cooling metal. That sound, the one I had missed, was a lullaby, proof of existence. I placed the spare key on the hook by the door where it had always belonged. Then I made tea. Real tea from loose leaves, not the tasteless bags my daughter brought, and drank it slowly, watching the steam curl upward like a small flag of victory. The following day, Evan called. I didn't pick up. He left a message, his voice tight and bewildered. "Grandma, did you take the car? Mom's freaking out." "We thought you weren't supposed to. What if something happened?" I deleted the message without listening to the end. Nothing had happened. That was the point. I went about my day quietly, answering no one, my secret resting in the garage like a heartbeat. For the next 2 days, I drove only short distances, to the post office, to the market, to the park. I avoided main roads, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted the drives to be mine alone, unremarked and unobserved. I noticed details I'd forgotten. The way the trees arched over Elm Street like a cathedral, the rhythm of the traffic lights, the smell of exhaust mingling with bakery air downtown. Every sense came alive again, not out of nostalgia, but reclamation. Each trip was a small defiance, a quiet assertion that my life still contained movement. One afternoon, as I returned from the grocery store, I caught sight of Dottie again. She waved from her porch and shouted, "Back behind the wheel, I see." I smiled and lifted my hand in acknowledgement. I could tell she didn't approve, but she also didn't interfere. Maybe she understood that pity and respect can't coexist. Inside, I unpacked my groceries, put everything in its place, and wrote a note to myself on the back of a receipt. Keep going. They don't get to decide when it ends. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since the keys had been taken. My dreams were simple. Just the sound of a road unfurling endlessly ahead, smooth and open, no turns, no stops, no one waiting to tell me what was safe. I woke before dawn, the air still blue and hushed, and sat by the window with my coffee. The world outside was still, but I felt motion inside me, slow and certain. I knew this calm wouldn't last, that sooner or later they would discover the truth and descend again with their lectures and their worried eyes. But for now, I had the keys, the car, and my name on every line that mattered, and that was enough. The morning they found out, it wasn't through confrontation, but through accident, as so many reckonings arrive, not with thunder, but with the quiet inevitability of a knock on the door. Evan appeared on my porch at 10, his expression a careful blend of guilt and authority, the same look I'd once seen on him as a child when he broke something, but had been told to apologize like a man. He was still holding himself that way now, though the stakes had grown larger than a shattered vase. "Grandma," he said, his voice polite, rehearsed, the kind of tone one uses with a skittish pet. "We just wanted to check in. Mom's worried." I invited him in because I am not an animal to be handled through thresholds. He glanced around the kitchen, saw the car keys hanging openly on their hook, and froze. His face changed. Not shock exactly, but something more complex, an expression of a man watching the story he's written for someone begin to erase itself, line by line. "You've been driving," he said finally, and the words hung there like a diagnosis. I didn't answer. I poured coffee, handed him a cup, and waited for him to sit. He didn't. He stayed standing, stiff with the righteousness of the young. "You could have told us," he said, and I could hear the hurt in it, though it wasn't the kind that deserved sympathy. It was the hurt of someone whose control had been interrupted. "You could have asked," I replied, and for a long time we simply stared at each other. Two people divided not by age but by conviction. My daughter called an hour later, her voice sharp. "What is wrong with you, Mom? Evan said you took the car back." "I didn't take it back," I said. "It was never yours to take." The silence on the other end was thick. "We were just trying to help," she said finally. "You don't see how frightening it is for us. What if you get in an accident? What if you hurt someone?" "What if I live?" I said. "Does that frighten you too?" She hung up. After that, there was a new kind of quiet around me. Not isolation, but space. Clean, open, defiant. It reminded me of the weeks after Derek's funeral, when people stopped visiting and I was left alone with the sound of my own breathing. That solitude had frightened me then, but now it felt like truth, like a room without furniture, but with honest air. I drove every morning after that, sometimes nowhere particular. I'd stop by the lake or the old hardware store, places that still remembered my name, places that didn't look at me like I was dissolving. I started keeping a small notebook in the glove compartment, jotting down fragments of things I saw. An elderly man watering his lawn, a child running with a kite, a couple arguing outside a bakery, their voices soft but fierce. I wanted to record the world as proof that I was still a witness, that my eyes still caught details, that observation itself was a form of existence. One morning, I stopped at a small diner on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that still served coffee in heavy mugs and didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. The waitress, a woman with silver hair and the weary grace of someone who'd seen every kind of human folly, greeted me with a simple, "Good morning, sweetheart," and it nearly undid me. That word, sweetheart, spoken without irony or pity, felt like a bandage pressed against a bruise. I sat by the window and ordered scrambled eggs and toast, and when she refilled my coffee, she said, "Haven't seen you around here before." I told her I used to come by years ago with my husband. She smiled, and something unspoken passed between us. That recognition women share when they see survival in each other. When I left, she said, "You drive safe now." Not because she doubted I could, but because that's what people say when they mean, "I see you." Back home, I began rearranging the house. It started small, moving the kitchen table closer to the window, replacing the dead plant on the sill with a jar of wildflowers I picked near the lake. Then the changes grew bolder. I cleaned out the closet of clothes I kept for no reason, packed up boxes of things that belonged to a life that no longer fit me. Every drawer I emptied felt like an exhale. It was strange how freedom demanded space. I realized then that what they'd taken from me wasn't just mobility. It was the illusion that my world had to shrink with age. I would not let that narrative be my inheritance. My daughter called less often now. When she did, her voice was brittle, stretched thin between duty and resentment. "Are you eating?" she'd ask. "Are you getting enough rest?" As if she were checking boxes on a form. "Yes," I'd say. "I'm eating, I'm resting, I'm driving." That last word always landed like a small explosion. She would sigh, mumble something about being careful, and hang up. I didn't miss her silence afterward. What I missed was the time before she'd turned love into management. It was around then that I met Howard. I ran into him at the farmer's market near the stall that sold honey and homemade bread. He was buying peaches, muttering about how they didn't taste like they used to, and I laughed without meaning to. He turned, smiled, and said, "Guess that makes two of us." There was nothing romantic in it, not at first. Just conversation, slow and easy. He was 76, a retired carpenter with hands that looked like they still remembered the shape of tools. We started meeting at the market on Saturdays, talking about books, weather, the absurdity of how the world now required passwords for everything. He asked one day if I'd like to take a drive out to the old lighthouse, said he hadn't been in years. I hesitated, then said yes. That drive became a turning point I hadn't planned. The road wound along the coast, the sea a restless sheet of silver beside us. We talked, not like two old people filling time, but like two equals. Trading truths. He told me about his late wife, how she'd driven until the very end, how her license renewal notice had arrived a week after her funeral. I told him about Evan, about the theft of my keys. He didn't offer sympathy. He just nodded and said, "They think fear is love. They don't understand that sometimes love is letting people risk themselves." When we reached the lighthouse, we walked the short trail to the bluff. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the horizon stretched wide and impossible. For the first time in months, I felt part of the world, not contained by it. I think that was the beginning of my shift, from survival to agency. When I got home that evening, I found a note slipped under my door. It was from Evan. The handwriting was tight and uncertain. "Grandma, please call us. Mom's worried sick. We just want to talk." The words didn't sting the way they once might have. They sounded small, almost childish. I folded the note and put it in my drawer with the spare key. Some things deserve to be kept as reminders, not wounds. I didn't call. Not yet. I needed more time living on my own terms before I let them hear the sound of that freedom in my voice. Days began to find their rhythm again. I volunteered at the library twice a week, shelving books in the quiet back room, losing hours in the company of paper and dust. I discovered that purpose is not something you retire from. It simply changes costume. In the afternoons, I met Howard for coffee or drove alone to the lake, watching the geese drift across the surface like slow-moving thoughts. Every evening, I wrote in my notebook. Nothing profound, just fragments of truth. "Today, I drove the long way home," one entry read, "not because I had to, but because I could." Another said, "Independence is not the absence of fear. It's walking into it with the key in your hand." The change inside me wasn't loud. It was subtle, like a tide shifting direction under the surface. But I could feel it all the same. I was no longer waiting for their approval, their calls, their permission. The act of living had become private again, sacred in its small routines. And though I knew the confrontation was not over, that the world of family and worry and control would circle back eventually, I also knew something irreversible had happened. I had begun to live for myself again, quietly, steadily, and without apology. It started with a phone call that didn't sound like a phone call at all, but like a storm gathering through a wire. My daughter's voice, tight and deliberate, announced itself without preamble. "Mom, we need to talk," she said. And before I could ask about what, she added, "We're coming over." The plural stopped me. We, not just her. That meant Evan, too. I sat there with the receiver against my ear, listening to the hum of the line, realizing that this was not a visit but an intervention disguised as conversation. "All right," I said quietly, because sometimes the only way to keep dignity intact is to walk willingly into the courtroom they've built for you. They arrived an hour later. I saw their car pull up through the lace curtains, my daughter in her pale coat, Evan stepping out beside her, his face already shaped into concern. They came in without waiting for me to open the door, bringing with them the smell of winter air and agitation. "We're worried," she began immediately, her words rehearsed, the kind of speech that comes with bullet points. "This isn't working, Mom. You driving again? It's reckless. You could get hurt. You could hurt someone else. We can't just ignore it." I stood by the counter, feeling my heartbeat in my throat, not from fear, but from the familiar exhaustion of being misunderstood on purpose. "You took my car without asking," I said, "and I took it back. That seems fair." Evan shifted uncomfortably, staring at the floor. My daughter crossed her arms. "It's not about fairness. It's about safety. You need to stop being so stubborn. This isn't just about you anymore." The phrase landed like a slap. Not about you. That's how they erase people. They turn your life into a collective project where everyone else gets a say. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I sat down instead, calmly, as if this were a business meeting. "What exactly do you plan to do about it?" I asked. My daughter blinked, thrown by the composure. "We've talked about options," she said, glancing at Evan for courage. "You could move into one of those assisted communities. Some of them are really nice with gardens and activities. Or if you want to stay here, we could set up something more structured. Maybe have someone come by to help a few days a week." "You mean a babysitter?" I said. "Don't twist this," she snapped, her voice cracking under its own weight. "We just want to make sure you're safe." I watched Evan's hands. They were fidgeting with the cuff of his sleeve the same way his mother's used to when she was a child caught in a lie. "Evan," I said softly, "tell me something. Did you tell her where I parked the car that day?" He hesitated, then nodded, and for a moment I saw not malice, but confusion. The same confusion that comes from being raised to equate love with obedience. "She was scared," he murmured. "We both were." I wanted to reach across the table and shake him, not out of anger, but to rattle the illusion that fear makes you moral. "You don't get to control people just because you're afraid of losing them," I said. My daughter's face hardened. "You think this is control? You've lost perspective, Mom. Maybe you don't realize it, but you're putting yourself and others in danger. If you can't recognize that, maybe it's time for someone else to step in." The air between us changed then. The polite disguises fell away. She wasn't talking to me as a daughter anymore, but as a warden justifying custody. I felt the tremor of something old and volcanic rising inside me, but instead of erupting, it crystallized into clarity. "Are you threatening to take legal action?" I asked. "Because if you are, say it clearly." Evan's eyes widened. "No one's threatening you," he said quickly, but his mother didn't deny it. "You're being dramatic," she said instead, her voice trembling just enough to betray her intention. "But yes, if that's what it takes to protect you, we'll talk to your doctor, maybe even the court, about evaluating your driving abilities. We can't let you do this to yourself." I looked at her and saw my own face in hers, younger, sharper, but with less patience for the truth. "You think you're saving me," I said quietly, "but you're just making me disappear." For a moment she flinched, like the words had cut through her armor, but then she straightened. "I'm not arguing about this anymore. It's decided." And that was when I understood. They had already written the next act of my life without consulting me. This conversation wasn't to seek agreement. It was to inform me of my own erasure. They left not long after, their voices tight and final, the sound of car doors slamming echoing like punctuation marks in the cold air. When the house fell silent again, I walked to the mirror in the hallway and looked at myself. My reflection stared back, calm, eyes dry. The same woman who'd driven through storms and funerals and empty highways. "Decided," I whispered. "By whom?" The question wasn't for them, it was for me. Because somewhere inside, I had begun to believe their story, that I was a fragile thing needing oversight. That belief had to die. The following days unfolded with a strange, deliberate slowness. I went about my business quietly, but every act felt charged. Making tea, sweeping the floor, feeding the cat, all of it became proof of competence, ritual against erasure. I drove only at dawn or dusk, when the roads were half asleep, and no one could witness my defiance. The car had become more than transportation. It was my confession, my rebellion, my prayer. I started parking it a few streets away, hidden behind a row of maple trees, just in case they decided to check in again. I wasn't being paranoid. I was adapting. One afternoon, I saw their car drive slowly past my house. I didn't move from the window. I let them look. They didn't stop. The next day, a letter came from my doctor's office, a reminder for my upcoming checkup, but with an odd note at the bottom. "Please bring any recent driving assessments if applicable." Assessments. The word burned. They'd called him. They'd actually started the process. I sat down and laughed, a quiet, disbelieving laugh that felt like it belonged to someone else. So this was how they'd do it, through paperwork and pity, through systems that pretended to care. I wasn't angry. I was something sharper, awake. That evening, I drove to the lake again, but this time I didn't park near the water. I kept going, past the town limits, until the road turned to gravel and the forest closed in around me. The headlights carved narrow tunnels through the dark. I pulled over and turned off the engine. The silence was immense, the kind of silence that has depth. I sat there and thought about the generations of women in my family, my mother, my grandmother, each of them diminished in polite ways, their lives whittled down to safety and service. It wasn't malicious. It was inherited. The language of love in our family had always been the language of protection, and protection, when overused, becomes possession. I stayed there for hours, until the air grew colder and the windshield fogged from my breath. I wrote a sentence in my notebook by the light of the dashboard. Every cage has a lock, but locks also open. The words steadied me. When I got home, I placed the notebook on the table beside the phone, ready for whatever came next. 2 days later, it came. A knock at the door. Not polite this time, firm, official. I opened it to find a man in a gray suit, middle-aged, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Clark?" he asked. "I'm with the Department of Motor Vehicles. I was informed there's a concern regarding your fitness to drive. We'd like to schedule a reevaluation." Behind him, I saw my daughter's car parked across the street. She didn't come to the door. She watched from inside, half hidden. The humiliation was surgical. I wanted to slam the door, to scream, but instead I said, "Of course. Schedule whatever you like." The man nodded, visibly relieved that I wasn't argumentative. He handed me a paper and left. When they drove away, I sat down on the porch steps, the form fluttering in my hand. I read it slowly, every sterile phrase, "For your safety, to ensure continued compliance, mandatory assessment." It was all written in the tone of benevolence, bureaucracy's favorite disguise. I folded the paper neatly and placed it in my coat pocket. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I called a lawyer. His name was George Holloway, a friend of Derek's from the old neighborhood, semi-retired but sharp as glass. I told him everything, every detail, every insult disguised as care. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said, "You did the right thing calling me. You own that car, correct?" "Yes." "Then it's simple. If they took it without consent, that's theft. And if they're using false pretenses to limit your rights, that's interference. Do you want to press charges?" I hesitated only a second. "Not yet," I said. "But I want it on record." He agreed. "Then we'll make it official. I'll file a statement." That night, I barely slept. The house hummed with a kind of restless energy, like the air before lightning strikes. I could almost hear Derek's voice in my head, calm and low. "Pick your battles, Marjorie." "I have," I whispered back. "And this one's mine." The next morning, I drove to the police station, the same one where I'd renewed my license for years. The officer at the front desk recognized me. "Morning, Mrs. Clark. What can we do for you?" I placed my hands on the counter, steady. "I'd like to report a theft," I said. "My vehicle was taken without my permission." The officer blinked. "Who took it?" "My grandson," I said. "He's a good boy, but that doesn't change what happened." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. "You want to file an actual report?" "I wouldn't be here otherwise." He gave me a form, and I filled it out carefully, each letter deliberate, my handwriting neat and unwavering. When I handed it back, he said, "You know this could cause trouble in the family." I smiled faintly. "It already has." He nodded, perhaps with admiration, perhaps with pity. I didn't care which. The report was filed. By the time I returned home, I felt lighter, not happy exactly, but anchored. The line had been drawn. They would come soon, I knew that. There would be tears, accusations, maybe even guilt. But I no longer feared any of it. There's a kind of freedom that comes only after you've stopped asking to be understood. It's the freedom of knowing who you are when no one believes you anymore. I made myself tea, sat by the window, and waited for the storm to arrive. When they came, it wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting at the door, no confrontation in the rain, no moment of grand revelation. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and windless, one of those days when even the birds seem undecided about flying. I was sitting at the table with my tea when I saw their car pull into the driveway, the same one that had carried them to every uncomfortable visit, every staged conversation about what was best for me. I didn't move. I waited. I wanted them to see that I was not preparing for a battle, that they were walking into a decision already made. Evan got out first, his coat half-zipped, his expression tense with the strained civility of someone hoping reason could still win the day. My daughter followed, clutching her purse as if she needed something to hold on to in order to stay steady. They stood at the door for a long time before she finally knocked. I let the sound echo through the house before I answered. She started speaking before I could even say hello. "Mom, we heard you went to the police," she said, her voice quivering between disbelief and accusation. "You filed a report against Evan. Is that true?" I stepped aside and gestured for them to come in. "You might as well sit," I said. "Yes, it's true." Evan's face went pale. "Grandma, why would you do that? I'm your grandson." "I wasn't stealing. I was trying to protect you." I looked at him and felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes only when there's nothing left to lose. "Protection without consent is still theft," I said. "You took my property without permission. You made choices for me that weren't yours to make. And you justified it by calling it love. But love doesn't take. It listens." My daughter's voice broke through the stillness, sharp and pleading. "Mom, please. You don't have to do this. We can talk to the officer, tell him it was a misunderstanding. You don't want this on Evan's record. It'll ruin his chances for grad school. He's terrified." She took a step toward me, but I stayed still. Then he should have thought about that before deciding that my independence was expendable. The words came out without anger, only finality. It was the tone I used to use when she was a teenager and had crossed a line she didn't yet understand. "You've both treated me like an object that can be moved around for convenience," I continued. "Do you know what it feels like to be erased politely? To have every protest labeled as confusion, every act of defiance mistaken for instability? I am not losing my mind. I am losing patience." Evan ran a hand through his hair, muttering, "This is insane." I almost smiled at the irony of it. How quickly the word insane appears when an older woman stops obeying. My daughter's eyes filled with tears, but I could see beneath them the anger, the panic that comes when control slips away. "You're making a mistake," she said, quieter now, as if lowering her voice might make it more persuasive. "Do you really want the police involved in our family's business?" I walked to the counter, picked up my cup, and took a slow sip before answering. "It became their business the moment you decided I no longer had rights." For a long time, no one spoke. The silence grew heavy, thick with everything that would never be undone. Evan paced by the window, his jaw tightening with every step. Finally, he turned to me and said, "I'll go talk to them. I'll fix this." I shook my head. "You can't fix what you refuse to understand." I could see the boy he'd once been in that moment, the one who used to build toy cars on my kitchen floor, asking me to race him. That boy had trusted me. This man pitied me. Somewhere in between, something precious had broken. They left soon after, but not before my daughter said the line that would echo in my mind for days. "You'll regret this when you're alone." I didn't answer. I watched their car pull away, the tires crunching over the gravel, and felt the smallest tremor of sadness move through me. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right in the way that only half-truths are. I would be alone, but I would also be free. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. It was Officer Ramirez from the station. He told me he had spoken with both of them. They'd admitted to taking the keys and moving the car without consent. "We're closing the case, ma'am," he said. "But if you'd like, we can keep the record on file." I told him to keep it. "Not for punishment," I said, "but for memory." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You don't sound angry," he said finally. "I'm not," I replied. "Anger's for when you still need something from them." After the call, I sat at the kitchen table, the late sunlight stretching across the linoleum in long golden stripes. I thought about the years of raising a daughter who had grown into a woman terrified of imperfection, a woman who measured love in acts of control. I thought about Evan, his earnestness, his fear, his untested sense of righteousness. They were not villains. They were inheritors of a world that tells the young that compassion means confiscation, that old age is something to be managed rather than lived. I realized then that I wasn't fighting them so much as I was fighting an entire language of care that had forgotten its root in respect. That evening, I drove again, not to the lake this time, but through the older part of town, where the houses still had wide porches and peeling paint, where the sidewalks remembered footsteps that no longer passed. I kept the windows down, the air cool against my face. The streets were mostly empty, the world pausing in that brief hour between working life and evening rest. I stopped at a red light and caught sight of my reflection in the side mirror. The face looking back at me was lined, yes, but steady. It was the face of someone who had made peace with being misunderstood. I thought of the women I'd known who'd surrendered quietly, who'd allowed themselves to be spoken for until they vanished. I wasn't going to be one of them. At the next intersection, I turned toward the ocean road. The horizon opened wide before me, an expanse of gray-blue water that blurred into sky. I parked near the overlook where Derek and I used to stop on Sundays, when life had been full of small errands and larger dreams. The wind was strong, carrying the scent of salt and rain. I stepped out of the car, stood there with my hands in my pockets, and let the cold air fill my lungs. I remembered his voice then, gentle, teasing. "Don't let them shrink you, Marjorie." I smiled, because I could almost hear him saying it now, and maybe he was. On the way back home, I stopped at the diner. The same waitress was there, wiping down tables. "Evening, sweetheart," she said. "Back again?" "Yes," I said, sliding onto a stool. "I needed a place where people mind their own business." She laughed. "Then you've come to the right spot." I ordered pie and coffee, and while she poured the cup, she said, "You look like someone who just did something hard." "Something necessary," I corrected her. She nodded, as if she understood. Maybe she did. By the time I returned home, the house felt different. It was still quiet, still filled with the faint hum of solitude, but the air had changed, lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. I took the keys from my coat pocket and placed them on the table right in the center, like an offering to no one but myself. Then I sat down and began writing a letter. Not to apologize, not to explain, but to leave a record in my own words. "If you ever read this," I began, "I want you to know I loved you both fiercely. But love is not obedience. It is trust. And you broke it the moment you decided I was too fragile, to live on my own terms. You will understand one day when someone decides you are too something, too tired, too slow, too irrelevant, and they take something from you in the name of care. When that happens, I hope you remember that I fought for this moment, not against you, but against the quiet death of self. When I finished the letter, I didn't sign it with love or regret. I just wrote my name, whole and unembellished. Marjorie Clark. Then I folded the paper and placed it in the top drawer beside the notebook, where I'd been keeping my thoughts. I turned off the lights, walked to the window, and looked out at the street. It was empty, lit by the soft orange glow of the lamppost, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything to happen. The confrontation was over. The ownership of my life had been reclaimed, not loudly, not triumphantly, but completely. That night, I slept without dreams. When morning came, I woke before dawn, made coffee, and stood in the doorway watching the first light stretch across the yard. The car sat in the driveway, a silhouette against the pale sky, ordinary and miraculous at once. I thought about everything it had come to mean, the theft, the fear, the freedom, and felt an odd gratitude toward the pain that had led me here. Sometimes I realized liberation doesn't arrive in a single moment of victory, but in a series of small, stubborn decisions that no one else understands. I sipped my coffee and whispered into the quiet room, "I'm still here." In the weeks that followed, the house began to sound different. The air was quieter but not hollow, like a pause held between movements of a long, unfinished song. My daughter didn't call for a while, and when she finally did, her voice had changed. It wasn't hard anymore, or full of that brittle authority that used to scrape against my patience. She spoke softly, like someone walking into a room where something sacred had happened. "Mom," she said, "I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a hesitation after that, the kind of silence where love tries to find a language it has forgotten. I told her I was fine, that the weather had been mild, that the hydrangeas in the front yard had finally bloomed again. I didn't mention the police report or the letter I had written. I didn't need to. We were both standing on opposite sides of a truth we couldn't unmake, and maybe that was enough. When she hung up, I sat for a long time with the phone in my lap, listening to the faint echo of her voice still lingering in the air. Evan didn't come by right away. I think shame has its own slow rhythm, a cautious kind of repentance that takes time to ripen. It was almost a month before I saw him walking up the driveway one afternoon, a plastic bag in his hand, his shoulders bent in that tentative way that belongs to the young when they're about to admit they were wrong but don't yet know how. He knocked softly, almost apologetically, and when I opened the door, he didn't speak. He just held out the bag. Inside were the spare keys, the ones he had taken from the hook weeks before and claimed to have misplaced. "I found them," he said, his voice small, uncertain. I took the bag, nodded once, and said, "You should have kept them safe the first time." He nodded too, eyes wet but proud enough not to let the tears fall. "I know," he said. I thought I was helping. "You were helping yourself feel powerful," I said. "That's different." We sat in the kitchen afterward, drinking lemonade and not talking much. The silence between us wasn't hostile anymore. It was something softer, like soil after rain. He looked around the room and said, "Everything's just like it was." "That's the point," I said. "The world doesn't fall apart because someone turns 78. He smiled faintly at that, and for a brief moment, I saw the boy he had been. the one who used to sit on this very counter eating cookies while I scolded him for leaving crumbs. "Mom's still upset," he said finally. "She doesn't understand why you couldn't just let it go." I stirred the ice in my glass and watched it melt. Because letting it go would have meant letting myself disappear. And I've spent too many years making sure I exist. After he left, I went out to the porch and watched the light fade over the neighborhood. The air was cool, the sky streaked with that tender gold that comes before dusk, and the sound of distant traffic hummed like a faraway heartbeat. I thought about how small revolutions happen quietly, not with declarations or victories, but with persistence, with the simple act of refusing to surrender one more piece of yourself. I had spent most of my life believing that peace meant compliance, that love meant yielding. Now I knew better. Peace, the kind that stays, is built on boundaries. The following Sunday, I drove to church for the first time since everything had happened. The congregation looked at me with polite surprise, a few smiles, a few nods. Dottie waved from her pew. After the service, one of the women approached me, her voice full of the cautious admiration people reserve for those who have stepped slightly outside the lines. "We heard about what happened with your family," she said. "You must be so strong." I smiled, not unkindly. "Strength has nothing to do with it," I said. "Sometimes you just get tired of being treated like a guest in your own life." She blinked, unsure whether to agree or retreat, and then patted my hand the way people do when they don't quite understand you, but want to believe they do. Later that afternoon, I drove to the coast again. The air was sharp with salt, the wind pulling at my scarf. I parked in the same place Derek and I used to sit, the radio low, the sea endless before us. I stayed there for a long time, watching the horizon shift and glitter. There was no drama in it, no great revelation, just the slow realization that I had reclaimed something they could never take again. Freedom, I learned, isn't about movement. It's about permission, the kind you give yourself when everyone else stops offering it. As the light began to fade, I opened my notebook and wrote a few lines. They thought they took my keys, but all they did was remind me where I'd hidden the spare. I smiled at my own words, folded the notebook closed, and started the car. The engine purred to life, steady and familiar, like an old friend. I didn't rush to leave. I let the sound settle around me, a reminder that even in stillness, there is ownership. When I got home, the house welcomed me the way only a lived-in place can, with the smell of coffee lingering from the morning, the faint creak of the floorboards, the soft murmur of the clock. I turned off the lights, left the door unlocked just for the night, and stood at the window looking out at the quiet street. Somewhere out there, other women like me were sitting in rooms filled with the ghosts of conversations they never finished, wondering if they had the right to start over. I wanted to tell them they did. I wanted to tell them that losing control of a steering wheel is not the same as losing control of a life, that sometimes the world will try to seatbelt you into stillness and call it safety, but the road is still yours if you remember where it begins. I went to bed with the window open, the night air cool against my skin. For the first time in a long while, I felt not watched, not managed, but alive in my solitude. Before I drifted to sleep, I whispered to the darkness, not as a prayer, but as an inheritance. They only win when you stop driving. The room stayed silent, but somewhere, in the steady hum of the world beyond the glass, I thought I heard the low, tender murmur of an engine turning over, steady, certain, and free.